Local writer and author of The Blind Side, Michael Lewis, speaks with the Daily Californian about becoming a writer and finding a home.
I didn't write for school newspapers. We had the Daily Princetonian was the newspaper of Princeton.
Right.
Never wrote for that. Never wrote for my high school newspaper. People liked reading the letters I wrote them. So I had a sense that I could entertain people on the page, kind of thing. But I didn't ever have any sense that was something you would do for a living. But when I got out of college, it was the moment I got out of college, I had a kind of panicky 6 or 8 months because I had no idea what I wanted to do. It's such a waste of a college education to turn it into vocational training because it is sort of this opportunity to graze, and that's how I used it. And but I got out, and of course, then you got to answer that question. And I thought the first conscious thought I had about being a writer was, how do I replicate being in college all the time in the real world? I spent a couple of years basically getting rejected, writing things, not knowing where to send them, not knowing anybody. And then I went to London for graduate school, did a master's in economics, and I saw an advertisement for a competition in The Economist. It said, write a 600-word piece for the science and technology section, and if you win the competition, you get a job. And I got a call from them, and they invited me to an interview, and they told me that I'd made the short list of 3 people for the job. And I was interviewed by a guy who's subsequently become a kind of well-known writer, Matt Ridley. He was shocked I was American, shocked that the only class I'd taken in college that was science-related was a class called Physics for Poets, and I'd flunked it. I'd taken a pass-fail to fulfill my science requirement, and I'd flunked it, and because I hadn't gone to the lab. He says to me, there's no way you're qualified for this job. And I remember the line, he said, you're a fraud, but you're a really good fraud. And that's basically journalism. That you're able to seem like you know a lot more than you do. Continue to write for us. And he published the piece. And I wrote, I don't know, a dozen, over the next year and a half, a dozen pieces for all the sections of The Economist. So that's how I started to get clips. I wrote more and more magazine pieces. They got more and more attention. I was working at Solomon Brothers, which is a big Wall Street firm. I wrote a piece about Wall Street. But to avoid getting in trouble with my employer, I wrote it under a pseudonym. And an editor of a book publishing firm figured out who the pseudonym was. He called the editor and I guess got my real name and called me in the middle of the night in London. He says, Ned Chase, I work at Simon & Schuster, and we think you should write a book. And so I hired an agent. Didn't end up going to him when I went to where I am now, Norton, and wrote my first book. Quit my job, wrote my first book. And from then it was easy. I was a writer. Yep. You know, it did so well that I didn't ever really have to look back or think about it again. So it's not a conventional story. I didn't grow up, you know, miserable and thinking, living my life, you know, on the page with some fictional existence. I kind of came to it for odd reasons. The world I grew up in, books just materialized out of the ether. You didn't think of anybody writing them, really. And here, you have a hard time finding in our neighborhood people who haven't written books. It's such a different sort of assumption. And it's kind of nice. It's nice to be a writer in a place where being a writer is normal. Nobody's that curious about you. They know how uninteresting it is. I've never felt at home any place but New Orleans. And I've lived a lot of places. But here is an exception. I feel at home here. As a writer, you don't have anything like that. Right. What you have is you choose who you spend time with, and you end up spending a lot of time with a handful of people. And that in itself never creates the feeling of roots. Never did anywhere else I lived. It was very enjoyable, but Washington and New York or London or Tokyo or other places I lived, they don't feel like home. Your kids go to school. You're forced back into lots of social interaction you wouldn't normally have with people who were just, you know, be acquaintances. But you establish a vast network of acquaintances, largely through your children. And it's those people, it's that vast network of acquaintances rather than a handful of really close friends that creates the feeling of home. It's the relationships you would have avoided, but you have. Right. That causes the place to feel like home.
For the Daily Californian, this is Kelly Feng.